They really do amazing work here. If you get a chance to come back and just get to witness firsthand the extraordinary work that West Sound Tech does, it really does change lives and open the doors of economic opportunity for people. The League of Women Voters, though, did not ask me to come and talk about the economy or about skills training. They asked me to talk about some of the dysfunction in our current politics. I'm very conscious that according to recent polling, I am a member of an institution that is held in lower regard than head lice and colonoscopies and the band Nickelback. I confess that dynamic, as Anne kind of walked through my personal path, it wasn't a no-brainer for me to pursue this job, largely because I was conscious that, one, if I was successful in this undertaking, I'd be signing up for a 3,000-mile commute, and two, like many Americans, I look at what happens in Washington, D.C. and find it somewhat repellent. It's very broken. And yet, at the end of the day, that was probably what got me to do it, which is I've got two little girls, and frankly, I don't want their future dictated by a completely screwed up federal government. And so I'm a believer that the best way to fix something is not to run away from it, but to get engaged. I thought I would talk about three things that are happening in our nation's capital in that regard. And the first is something that you may have heard about and that's getting some attention. And that's on the legislative front, a bill called H.R. 1, which is a big democracy reform bill. It was the first major piece of legislation passed in this Congress. H.R. 1 is really focused in three areas. First, it represents big, bold reform in the campaign finance arena, trying to reduce the role of money in our politics, trying to empower we the people rather than special interests. And it does that in a handful of ways. First, by setting up a system of match funds, so we have citizen-financed elections, small dollar campaigns rather than big super PACs. Two, it includes a bill called the Disclose Act, which says at the very least, if these super PACs want to dump a bunch of money into American elections, that we as citizens should have a right to know who's trying to influence our elections, that they should have to put their name on it, that there should be disclosure requirements. The bill also includes a couple of bills that I'm the lead sponsor of. One is a bill to reform the Federal Election Commission. How many of you have heard of the Federal Election Commission? So the Federal Election Commission was set up after Watergate, basically to be the referee, to blow the whistle on campaigns that cheat. And it worked for quite some time until it didn't. And unfortunately, in recent years, the Federal Election Commission has been almost as dysfunctional as Congress. And I say that in part because it was set up with 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans on the commission, and almost every decision now of the Federal Election Committee stalemates at a 3-3 tie. If the Federal Election Commission is the referee to blow the whistle on candidates that cheat, in recent years it's been a very dysfunctional referee, not unlike the referee that ref the 2005 Super Bowl where the Seahawks got screwed by the referee. I'm still not over it, and I just want to take that moment to stick it to the NFL. But unfortunately, in the past year, though, things have gotten worse in that the Federal Election Commission has now lost a quorum, which means it can't even do its job. It can't promulgate new rules, and it can't even enforce the rules that are meant to govern our system. I just joined one of my colleagues, John Sarbanes, in sending a letter to the president asking that this get addressed because now the referee is completely off the field. But I'm a sponsor of a bill to try to strengthen the Federal Election Commission, get the ref back on the field and more effectual. Interestingly enough, that is a bipartisan bill that was included in H.R. 1. Also included in H.R. 1 is a bill that I'm the lead sponsor of called the Honest Ads Act. The Honest Ads Act deals with online political expenditures. Right now, if any of you run for office, and you buy TV ads, that's publicly disclosable information. The cable company or the TV station is actually required to keep something called the public file, where all of us and the press are able to see who's trying to buy ads, how much they're spending. Also true in radio. If you buy a radio ad, that's publicly disclosed information. We all have access to that information. That is not true when it comes to internet expenditures. So why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem, one, because we've seen more and more political spending migrate into the online arena. And two, we know that foreign governments have sought and foreign actors have sought to influence America's election through the internet. And so I'm a sponsor of a bill called the Honest Ads Act. It's got either 18 or 19 Democratic sponsors and 18 or 19 Republican sponsors. We very intentionally tried to keep it bipartisan in hopes of seeing some progress, not just in the House, but in the Senate as well. So that also is part of H.R. 1. So there's a big chunk of H.R. 1 that's focused on campaign finance reform. Part of H.R. 1 is focused on other reforms outside of the campaign finance arena, ethics reforms. For example, it includes a requirement that any candidate for president and vice president, regardless of party, regardless of experience, should have to release their tax returns to be a candidate for office. So that the American people can be confident that the decisions that are being made in their interest, in the public interest, not in someone's personal, private financial interest. Two, it includes a provision that prohibits any federal elective office holder from serving on a corporate board. Right now, that is not a prohibition that exists. I think that's a problem. I don't serve on any corporate boards. However, there are members of Congress that have, and I think you should feel confident that decisions being made are made in your interest, in the public interest, not in someone's private interest or a corporate interest. So there's a whole chunk of reforms in the ethics arena. And then finally, part of H.R. 1 is focused on reforms associated with voting rights. Trying to have a national holiday for Election Day, trying to improve the ability of people to register to vote and to be able to exercise their voting rights. It sets the table and lays out a process for another bill called H.R. 4, that would be a new Voting Rights Act, basically taking the guidance that the U.S. Supreme Court provided in its Shelby County versus Holder decision to put the teeth back into the Voting Rights Act. When I didn't agree with that decision, I did not like that decision, but when the Supreme Court invalidated part of the Voting Rights Act, it included in its decision some guidance to Congress to say, if you want to address some of these historical acts of discrimination and put the teeth back into the Voting Rights Act, here's basically how you could do it. And so Congress is, in the instance of H.R. 1 and H.R. 4, following that guidance. Interestingly enough, also in H.R. 1, part of trying to ensure access to voting rights is to address the issue of partisan gerrymandering. This bill does something I think that is important, which is it suggests that voters should choose their elected officials rather than elected officials choosing their voters. And establishing bipartisan or nonpartisan redistricting commissions. So that's H.R. 1. And I mention this to you because I think part of the way we address some of the dysfunction in our nation's capital is to fix some of the fundamental problems that currently exist, including money in politics, barriers to the ballot box, and concerns around ethics. So that's one. Secondly, and Ann mentioned this in her introduction, about every 20 or 30 years or so, Congress recognizes that things aren't working the way they ought to. And they create a committee to do something about it. This year's committee is called the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. I know that sounds like a super interesting committee. But interestingly enough, it's a committee that's gotten strong bipartisan support for its creation. It was created in a rules package at the beginning of the year, and it's actually very unusual when the House passes its initial rules package at the beginning of a Congress for rules to pass in a bipartisan way. One of the rules that was voted on was to create this committee, and interestingly enough, it had, I think, near unanimous support to create this committee. because I think there's an understanding that Congress is punching under its weight right now. And it was tasked explicitly with looking at some specific issues. So among them are issues like staffing. Right now, there is not a position in Congress, either in member offices or on committee staff, with a median tenure of longer than 3 years. So why is that a problem? Well, it means that institutional capacity has eroded. And as a consequence, when you have that level of turnover, what ends up filling that void is the executive branch and lobbyists. And that does not serve the interests of the American people. So one of the things that the committee was tasked with looking at, and has actually now passed recommendations related to, is to try to deal with recruitment, retention, and diversity of staff within the House. And we've actually, as a committee, we've made some recommendations in that space. And I can talk about some of the specifics that we looked at if you're interested in that, but I'll just kind of give you a broad overview. One of the things that Congress was asked to look at, that this committee was asked to look at, was the use by Congress of technology to interact with constituents, technology to solve problems, technology to including issues like internal cybersecurity issues. One of my colleagues put it, I think, actually really well. She said, Congress is an 18th century institution using 20th century technology to solve 21st century problems. And that's entirely true. This is something that has started to get more attention. And in fact, Elizabeth Warren, in her presidential campaign, has called for something that our committee just passed a recommendation on, which is the reestablishment of an office called the Office of Technology Assessment. The Office of Technology Assessment existed for decades and was disbanded in the mid-90s. The Office of Technology Assessment was tasked with largely trying to understand evolving technology and making sure that Congress was smart about those issues. How many of you either watched or heard about the Facebook hearings in Congress? I think one of the things that really frightened a lot of Americans was the degree to which members of Congress didn't really seem to be tracking with evolving technology. And again, in the absence of institutional capacity to understand these technical, complicated issues, the concern is that lobbyists have too much say, and that the executive branch has too much say. And so part of, again, to Ann's point about, why am I here, to talk about, how does Congress basically reassert some of its authority. Part of that is making sure that it has the capacity to reassert its authority. So one of the recommendations that has been passed was to reestablish a reformed Office of Technology Assessment. Some of the issues we've been asked to look at include things like, how do you open up the process and have greater transparency for the American people? Interestingly enough, and it's good to see my friend Larry Sequist here, we served in the state legislature together. The state legislature does something that I actually think is pretty interesting. When there is a bill or an amendment in the state legislature, we all, as citizens, are able to look at that bill or look at that amendment in the context of what the existing law is and see what's being added or see what's being stricken. That is not true in Congress. If you look at a bill or an amendment, it is largely gibberish. As citizens, we should not have to hire attorneys to understand what our elected officials are doing. We should be able to understand what's going on. And we took, as a committee, we took testimony from from state legislatures about, okay, what do you do to drive more transparency in the process? And we adopted 5 recommendations specifically to try to open up transparency for the American people so that folks could have an understanding of what Congress is or isn't trying to do. We've also been tasked with looking at rules and processes. And this is actually a pretty important issue, specifically with regard to the budget process. So we just had a handful of hearings and discussions related to the budget process. I think sometime this fall, you will see the committee make some recommendations about budget and appropriations process. Well, why does that matter? One, we had in our recent hearing, a witness testified that only 27% of U.S. senators and 16% of US representatives have been in office long enough to have seen the federal funding process work as intended. I'll give you a personal experience. When you become a new member of Congress, they have freshman orientation, almost like going to college. And in our freshman orientation, we had the Congressional Research Service come and do a presentation on the budget and appropriations process. And as they walked through it, they did spend probably about 25 minutes saying, here's how the process and the law is established. You know, the House passes a budget, the Senate passes a budget, they agree on an overall budget, and that sets a resolution through which then 12 appropriations bills get written dealing with these 12 different areas of government. The House passes their appropriations bills, the Senate passes their appropriations bills, then they resolve them in conference, and these 12 appropriations bills get signed by the president. And they spent literally 25 minutes walking through this, and I was like, oh, okay, I get that. And then at the end of the 25 minutes, they said, well, so it doesn't work like that at all. Now let me tell you how it actually works. And I was like, well, wait a minute, what you just described actually kind of made sense to me. And so literally in recent years, and I think this is part of the reason we've seen government shutdowns, and as we see right now, something called a continuing resolution, where Congress simply funds government based on last year's funding going forward. So in essence, kicking the can, in this instance, a couple of months. And that's a problem. It's a problem certainly for areas like ours, where the largest employer is the federal government. I just met with some shipyard workers Thursday. And you know, there's a real concern about the potential for shutdown. And listen, continuing resolutions are not just bad for federal workers, they're bad for taxpayers. Right? Think about if you contracted for a service. If you contracted for a year, you get a better deal than if you contracted for 2 months and then 2 weeks and then another 2 months, and then, you know, this can kicking is bad for all of us as taxpayers. So one of the things that Congress is making it will be that this committee is looking at is the budget appropriations process. In addition, we had now 3 weeks ago a hearing on something that I think all of us are somewhat attuned to and concerned about, and that is civility. I don't know about the rest of you. I think sometimes it's hard to watch Congress in action. That's both in action and inaction. And the level of incivility in our politics, I think, is troubling. And so we had a hearing basically looking at some of the problem statements associated with that. Interestingly enough, one of the things that we took testimony on was when even the freshman orientation process that I spoke about, even that, your first day on the job starts in a partisan way. You're literally segregated by party. Democrats get on the Democratic bus and the Republicans get on the Republican bus. You know, the part of the recommendations that our committee is making and has made and will continue to make is focused on trying to do away with things like that. Right? That does not make sense to immediately put everybody on treating this like a game to be won rather than problems to be solved. Coming up, we're going to have a hearing this upcoming week on the issue of schedule and calendar. I know that's appointment viewing on C-SPAN. But why does that matter? Well, it matters because right now there's sort of two problems. One, Congress is not in Washington, D.C. enough to solve problems. This year, I think Congress is there 65 full days and 63 half days. So, you know, I will fly to Washington, D.C. Tuesday morning, arriving at about 5 o'clock to my office. We will have votes at 6:30. We will have a full day Wednesday and Thursday, and then votes Friday morning, and Congress will be basically done at noon on Friday. I will stay there and work until my 5:30 flight back home to our district. But so I give you that sense. So, and then on top of that, you have a challenge, which is within that time period, most members are on usually 2, some instances 3 committees, and on each of those committees, 2 or 3 subcommittees. So you're basically trying to, you know, if you may have seen sometimes when you're watching C-SPAN, it looks like no one's ever there, and it's not that they're ditching, it's that they're in 3 committee hearings at the same time, and so you have members show up for a few minutes, ask their round of questions, run to their next committee hearing, and I would argue, again, that doesn't work for the American people, right? Because your job on a committee is to get smart about an issue and to solve problems for the American people. And so one of the things that our committee is tasked with is looking at schedule and calendar and perhaps making some recommendations about how that may work better for the American people. If it sounds like I keep referencing the phrase, make Congress work better for the American people, it's because that's really, as we look at all of these issues, that's the North Star, right? The technology recommendations we're making, the civility recommendations we're making, the staffing recommendations are all focused on making Congress work better for the American people. I will mention one other thing about this committee. Have I already talked longer than you want me to? Sorry. Is it okay? So we did something a little interesting, and I mention this in part because we didn't do it to get press attention. We haven't asked for press attention about it. We certainly haven't gotten any press attention for it, but I actually think you would appreciate learning about this. So we did something a little bit different when this committee was established. Usually what happens when a committee is established, the first thing that happens is they get their budget, and then there's some math that happens, and you divide by 2. And Democrats get their half of the committee money, and Republicans get their half of the committee money. And the Republicans use their half of the money to hire people, generally who have a Republican background, to staff the committee, and they put on red jerseys. And then Democrats hire their people, generally who have Democratic backgrounds, and they have them work for the Democrats on the committee, and they put on blue jerseys. They don't actually put on the jerseys, but you get what I'm saying. And when our committee was established, I talked to my Republican counterpart, who, by the way, is not our ranking member, he's our vice chair. It was set up very specifically to be a committee that would work in a bipartisan way. I had a conversation with Tom Graves, who's a conservative Republican from Georgia, and I said, so what about if we just don't do that? What if instead of dividing by 2, what if we force multiply and said, we will hire a team that doesn't put on a red or a blue jersey, but puts on a fixed Congress jersey. And we'll hire some people who have a Democratic background and some people who have a Republican background, but the common denominator will be they're all people who are committed to trying to fix Congress. And to his credit, he said, yeah, we should do that. We should do that because we have too little time and too much to do. We should do that. I would mention our committee was also established to be bipartisan. It has 12 members on the committee, 6 Democrats and 6 Republicans. To make a recommendation, our committee requires a supermajority vote. And so by its very nature, our committee, and I actually think this is important because if you're going to do systemic change, I would argue that it has to be bipartisan because it can't be designed to advantage or disadvantage either of the parties, but rather it just has to focus on trying to fix Congress so that it functions better for the American people. So why do I mention this? There has not been a select committee in modern history that has passed a single recommendation. Last year, there was a Budget and Appropriations Process Reform Committee on which I served that passed 0 recommendations in the year that it was tasked with working. Before that, you may remember the Super Committee that was supposed to solve the issue of sequestration and deal with our nation's long-term fiscal challenges. That Super Committee passed 0 recommendations. Going back to the 90s, there has not been a select committee that has passed a single recommendation. So why do I mention this? Our committee is now past 29. And it's past 29, and every single one of these recommendations has been unanimous. So I tell you this because, one, to hopefully give you some sense of hope that there is a chance to do this. We made a conscious decision to work really hard to try to find common ground, and if we can find common ground, make recommendations, pass them out, and keep moving. Rather than waiting till we basically have a year to work on this. We didn't really have a year to work on this. We didn't get committee members until March. We didn't get committee funding until April, and then we hired up very quickly. So even in the basically 5 months we've been at it, we've been very conscious about trying to work together, work quickly, make recommendations, and keep moving, rather than waiting till the end of the year, trying to basically write a report. I think the American people need something more than a report. You need change. We need change so that Congress actually starts at least punching at its weight, ideally above its weight for the American people.
Here, here.
Let me mention one third category of things that I want to share with you, and then I'll move on to questions. And that is, the third thing that I'm trying to work on, and Ann mentioned this in my introduction, is I now co-chair a group in Congress called the Bipartisan Working Group. And it's a group of a dozen Democrats and a dozen Republicans who meet for breakfast each week. And it's a meeting in 3 parts. The first part of the meeting, we go around the room, and anybody who's working on something where they want to invite collaboration or co-sponsorship is given an opportunity to make a pitch. In fact, I just made a pitch regarding a bill that I introduced last Friday, focused on reducing student debt. It's a bill we called the Pell Plus bill, to basically put the Pell Grant on steroids to help students and their families avoid taking on more student debt. That was a bill that I introduced last Friday with one of my Republican colleagues named Susan Brooks, who's a member of the Bipartisan Working Group. So we basically worked on it together, introduced it together. Second part of the meeting, we talk about what's going on in Congress that week. And those can be feisty conversations, right? You know, if you're talking about taxes or healthcare, or as we did a few weeks back about impeachment, those can be tough conversations. But I'm increasingly of the belief that good democracy is a little bit like a good marriage. You know, you don't necessarily agree with your partner on everything, but you have to be able to talk to each other and listen to each other, and not have every interaction turn into the Jerry Springer show. And so that's part of what we do, is we just dialogue about things that we don't always agree on. And then the third part of the meeting, we talk about a big hairy issue facing the country and where we might be able to find some common ground on that issue. In fact, I mentioned that Federal Election Commission reform bill. That actually came from the Bipartisan Working Group. I invited a guy named Trevor Potter. Trevor Potter was a former Republican appointee to the Federal Election Commission. He was the attorney for John McCain's presidential campaign. I had heard of him because he was the attorney for Stephen Colbert's Super PAC, People for a Better Tomorrow. And I thought he was on the show. And I invited him to come meet with us. And when he did, he said, I want to talk to you about something you probably don't know about, the Federal Election Commission. He sort of broke down some of the problems and he gave us some ideas. And at the end of the meeting, I said, you know, I'd be willing to work on that. One of my Republican colleagues said, you know what, I'd work on that with you. And so we were able to work on a bill together, not to advantage or disadvantage one party or the other, but just to try to fix it. And when we introduced that bill, it was the first bipartisan campaign finance reform bill in more than a decade. And so again, it's not like we're sitting around the room holding hands and singing Kumbaya around the table, or closing our eyes and doing trust falls into each other's arms. We stopped doing that after we dropped a guy, but it's sort of the hour of each week where I find myself thinking we need to do more of that, frankly, not just as a Congress, but as a country too. The other thing, last week, I was in Northwest Arkansas for 2 days. I have now participated in a few what are called congressional exchanges or civility exchanges, where I have gone to one of my Republican colleagues' districts and had them come to mine. So there is a conservative Arkansas Republican named Steve Womack, with whom I serve on the Appropriations Committee. I brought him out to our district earlier this year, and I took him to the Naval Shipyard, and they briefed him up on some of the infrastructure challenges we have here, and he was like, that was really important. That sounds like something, we serve on the Defense Appropriations Committee together. He was like, that's something that we need to deal with. We took him out to the Port of Tacoma. The Port of Tacoma did a bang-up job saying, here's how many containers come through the Port of Tacoma and end up in Arkansas, and here's how many containers leave Arkansas and come to the Port of Tacoma and go to the rest of the world. And to walk away from that and have my Republican colleagues say, like, I guess I now care about freight mobility in the Puget Sound region, right? Because it's relevant to his district. And I took him up Hurricane Ridge, and the Park Service did a bang-up job talking to him about the maintenance backlog within our park system. And as we were coming down Hurricane Ridge, he said, Kilmer, now I understand why you always talk about the maintenance backlog and why you have this bipartisan bill to try to address the maintenance backlog. And so I mentioned this to you. I actually think part of the way we get a better understanding of where people are coming from is to understand where people are coming from. And so I spent 2 days in Northwest Arkansas, and we visited the University of Arkansas and did a town hall meeting with a group of students. Turns out, students in Arkansas also concerned about student debt. We visited some of the employers in Arkansas, including the J.B. Hunt Trucking Company. Turns out they're really concerned about infrastructure investment too, and freight mobility too. So having those sort of interactions, and listen, there's a whole bunch of things that I disagree with Steve Womack on. Right? There's a whole lot of issues that I disagree with my Republican colleagues on and with this administration on. I look at part of my job as standing my ground when I think things are happening in our nation's capital that don't serve the interests of the people I represent or are not reflective of the values of our country. But the other part of my job is actually working hard to find common ground where we can. Because I think part of the reason Congress is held in such low regard is when progress isn't even being made on the issues on which there is agreement. So that's why I'm taking the approach that I'm taking. I hope that makes sense. And I know my staff only prepared two pages of talking points for me, but I took way more than that. So I want to apologize if that was far too long or not interesting, but hopefully it gave you a sense of some of the stuff that I'm up to. I'd be eager to hear what's on your minds if you have suggestions, questions, concerns, comments, compliments.
I would just ask one question. You talked recommendations.
Hold on.
I'm sorry. You talked about 29 recommendations.
Yeah.
How many of those have since become? I think that force of law is the wrong term.
Yeah.
But have come
It's
to
the right
fruition
term.
and are
Yeah.
in force.
It's the right term. So the committee was established without jurisdiction to basically pass things into law, but rather to pass recommendations. Having said that, we decided to do something a little bit different. Again, rather than producing a report, we want to actually fix things. And so our first round of recommendations were all oriented towards transparency. So we made 5 recommendations around transparency. And we put it in our quarterly report that the rule establishes that we're required to do, but then we did something a little bit different and we turned it into legislative text. We turned it into a bill that is now sitting in the House Administration Committee, and all 12 members of our committee signed on as co-sponsors, all 6 Democrats and all 6 Republicans, and the House Admin Committee is expected to take action on that legislation this month. The next round of 24 recommendations we should introduce as bill text probably next week, with a commitment from all of the members of the committee that all 6 Democrats and all 6 Republicans will sign on to that legislation and see action out of the House Admin Committee. So that's basically the approach that we're using. So the short answer to your question is none yet, but we're working on it. There's a ton to do, right? So it's actually really challenging. You're basically trying to study issues, evaluate potential solutions, turn it into legislation, and keep moving, right? But we're working on it, and I think we're making progress.
Good answer. Thank you.
Thanks, you bet.
Yeah, and that question was the same that I had on here. What's the life of a recommendation?
Yeah.
After it's turned into a bill, what do you personally do to help try and pass that bill? I mean,
Yeah.
you don't stop once the bill is introduced.
Correct.
It has more life to it. So what do you personally do to help it
Yeah.
stay alive and pass?
This is something that has been a topic of conversation with my Republican counterpart, Tom Graves, in that part of the work we're doing is trying to evangelize not just the problems but the solutions with our colleagues. So if you were to look at my calendar for the next couple of weeks, you would see that I'm visiting a lot of the caucuses and coalitions to basically brief them on here's what this select committee has been working on, and some of the recommendations we have. So we're basically trying to elevate these issues, get it on people's radars, with the idea that legislation is more likely to move if people understand what the problem is and how we're proposing to solve it. So like next Wednesday, I'm meeting with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, and we've got I'm pitching it to the entire Democratic caucus. We put in a briefing when the Democratic caucus meets, and then my Republican counterpart is doing the same thing within the Republican conference.
With regard to the intersection of civility and technology, what's your sense of the benefit or role of Twitter in government?
So there's a few, it's a complicated question and a complicated answer. Social media in many ways has enabled people to connect with public, with the public arena in a different way and have access to probably more information than they might have otherwise had, and in different ways, right? When we do a town hall meeting, and I do a bunch of town hall meetings, we may get many of you to show up. The League of Women Voters is obviously super active, and I know many of you in this room, and you're very active and you show up. If we do a Twitter town hall or a Facebook Live town hall, we get generally an entirely different group of people that participate. And that's a good thing too, because you know what, I represent everybody, right? Not just the people who have the time and wherewithal to show up at the Admiral Theater or at West Sound Tech for a town hall. So to some degree, there's some value in it in terms of people being able to engage on issues of public policy and with their elected officials in a different way. Having said that, you asked a specific question around what it means for civility, and I would argue that sometimes the tone that is used in the social media realm is different and can be more toxic. There are things people may be more willing to say behind a keyboard than that they would say in sitting around a round table at West Sound Tech. And that doesn't just apply to constituents, that applies to elected officials too, including the president. And I think I have concern about that just because I have certainly tried to, as your representative, not just in what I do in the physical realm, but in the online realm, try to ensure that I'm not contributing to the toxicity of our politics, that I'm not making it worse, and that I'm able to look you in the eye and my kids in the eye and myself in the mirror and trying to comport myself in a way that's consistent with your expectations of me and my kids' expectations of me and my expectations of myself. That's not, listen, I mean, when my grandma turned 105, I posted happy birthday to her. And like the first 3 comments were, one form or another of, I'm sure she's ashamed of you for this, that, or the other thing. And I thought, man, that's a bummer, right? Like, that's not great. I've had my daughters say to me with regard to how the president has sometimes used Twitter. It was really compelling to me when one of my daughters said, if you said that in our school, you'd get suspended for that. And so I think that there should be some expectation that we hold ourselves to high standards, whether it be in person or in the online arena. Let me just say one other thing about that. And it's something that all of us should be thinking about, and I know Larry Sequist has thought a lot about it. And that is, how do we engage with people with whom we have disagreements? It's funny, sometimes when my staff doesn't know what to do with me, they send me to go stand on people's porches. And even outside of campaign season, in summer of 2017, I remember knocking on doors on the north end of Tacoma. And it wasn't a campaign year. I wasn't going to their porch to say, I'm asking for your vote. I was literally standing on people's porches saying, hey, I'm Derek Kilmer, I'm your congressman. What's on your mind? Because I think there's value, again, because not everybody can show up at West Sound Tech. Not everyone can show up at a town hall meeting. But I represent them too, right? And so I stood on people's porches, hey, I'm Derek Kilmer, I'm your congressman. And I had a guy say to me, he said, I have a question for you. And I said, shoot. And he said, do you know anyone who voted for Donald Trump? And I said, yeah, I know a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump. And I said, 3 of the 6 counties I represent voted for Donald Trump. And he said, you know what, I don't know anybody who voted for Donald Trump. And he said, it struck me that's kind of a problem. Because he said, I don't even understand kind of the thinking there. And he said, I went on my social media page and said, I would like to have coffee with a Trump voter, and I'll treat. And I said, so what happened? He said, well, I had all of my Democratic friends call me a traitor, and I had a bunch of Republicans call me a snowflake. And he said, so it never happened. And so I think part of what we need to be thinking about is like, so how do we engage people who may think differently than we do? I think it's something that the League of Women Voters certainly thinks a lot about, and trying to ensure that we have these interactions even on things where there may be strong disagreement. But that's our founders expected that we would have, or that we wouldn't agree on everything, but that we would work through those issues. Sorry, that was a really long answer.
Yes, I wanted to thank you for your discussion of House Bill 1. I think
Yeah.
it's very impressive. It's the kind of thing that the League, I think, would definitely support.
Right.
So what are its chances with your work? Maybe in the House it'll pass, but what is going to happen in the Senate? How does all this look in that chamber?
Specifically with regard to HR 1, Leader McConnell, before it was even voted on, said this bill will be dead on arrival in the Senate.